Okay, so we are recording and we are on, and yes, today, chapter 12, the devil. Um, that is our topic. Um, and yeah, so this is the shadow workshop, and we've been taking a pretty deep dive, I think, into I guess what we just call the psyche, right? And we sort of have the individual version of the psyche and the collective version, the collective unconscious. And essentially they function kind of the same way. It's like everything we learn about ourselves kind of applies to the whole organism, and vice versa. And today we're getting into we're going to talk about the devil, um, which is the Western kind of mythological archetypal personification of evil, or of the dark, sort of the dark energies that are emerging out of the collective unconscious. You might be surprised to find out that I actually wrote. So my goal, a big part of my goal with writing this book was to essentially give commentary on Jung's letter to Wilson from 1961. We looked at that last time with the Spiritus contra Spiritum, the thirst for wholeness, right? And this chapter too really grows out of the body of that letter, um, and because Jung talks about the devil. So I sent the letter to the WhatsApp group so you can read it, maybe try to get a handle on what he's saying there. Um, and I keep in mind too, I think the letter that Jung wrote to Bill Wilson is one of our most cherished pieces of writings within the 12-step fellowships. I think it's probably done a lot to really open the door to the psychotherapeutic community, right? And sort of for them to be somewhat accepting of us as alcoholics, even though there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. But today we're going to look at really kind of probably the most, maybe what I think could be the most confusing aspect of that letter. So we'll jump right in. So I wanted to touch on something from last week. I've been talking a lot about active imagination. And this sort of is like the thing, as we go through all this theory, right? Like we need something to concretize it, to make it real, somehow some sort of practice that we can use, right? And active imagination is that thing. Um, and so one of the things to keep in mind with active imagination, Ming pointed this out to me this week, is that it's really an interesting way to address or to approach inventory, right? So when we do active imagination, what we're really looking for is more information about the parts of ourselves that we can't really see. And so and we want to do the same thing in terms of dreams as well, right? We're sort of asking the psyche to give us insight about those causes and conditions, right? And so we do this kind of on the surface, I think, with our sponsors and as we work the steps. And I think later on, kind of what Jung is guiding us towards, and what I'm inviting us to all consider, is that we can do this on our own in a much more effective and kind of really kind of deeper way, right? By getting the information directly from the source ourselves, which is the objective psyche. And and it's important to keep in mind that when we are asleep, our ego is essentially taken out of the picture. And so what those dreams represent is literally a direct channel to the inner world, right? So if we really want to know what's going on with ourselves, we can look at our dreams, and then we can sort of combine that with active imagination, and that helps us to come up with more solutions, right, to these problems that we have. And the real problems require irrational solutions, right? And we understand this in the 12 steps, like in the world of the ego, um, that the solutions are irrational. Like if I tell my sponsor I just got fired and he tells me to go to a meeting, those two things don't mix, right? But yet me going to a meeting is actually the thing that will help and kind of resolve my dumbass for getting fired, right? And those are kind of the sort of paradoxes we encounter early on in sobriety. so later on in sobriety, we're trying to get to a deeper level for those those pesky problems that don't really go away. So this is just a statement from Jung where he's speaking about symbols and just kind of defining what they are. He says symbols are tendencies whose goal is as yet unknown. This does not contradict the statement that symbols are the best possible formulation of an idea whose referent is not clearly known. Such an idea is always based on a tendency to represent its referent in its own way. We may assume that the same fundamental rules obtain in the history of the human mind as well in the psychology of the individual. In other words, it goes back to that collective versus individual thing. They're essentially functioning the same way. In psychotherapy, it often happens that long before they reach consciousness, certain unconscious tendencies betray their presence by symbols, occurring mostly in dreams, but also in waking fantasies and symbolic actions. Often we have the impression that the unconscious is trying to enter consciousness by means of all sorts of illusions and analogies, or that it is making more or less playful attempts to attract attention to itself. So, and what we're looking at sort of, we've talked about the highest and the lowest, positive, negative, etc., right? And Jung here is referring to these playful attempts by the unconscious to get our attention, right? But when we pivot and we talk about evil and the devil, then we see that those attempts aren't always playful, right? They're very often very dark and destructive even. So so the point of this is that to try to pay attention to the dreams, and then also whatever kind of fantasies we have about them, just that we allow our psyche to sort of imagine these things and to play with the symbols, right? And to allow the symbols to evolve. So this basically jumping into the chapter, right? So typically like every chapter, this one kind of starts with sort of a summary of what we've talked to so far, and then it sets the stage for a discussion about the devil. This is what the first paragraph of the chapter says. By offering a glimpse into the hidden dynamics of the psyche, archetypal religious images reveal the nature of the fundamental opposition embedded within. So far, we've encountered those energies in the trickster and the alcoholic, but there is another primary opposition that Jung mentioned in his letter to Bill, which also figures heavily into the psychology of the modern West, reflected in the cosmic conflict between Almighty God, the Tsar of Heaven, and God's arch nemesis, the devil, the purveyor of evil. Like the other symbolical forms we've already covered, these characters of Western myth are images that the universal mind produces to express the transformative energy of the cosmos in a way that our egos might be able to more fully comprehend. Psychologically speaking, our myths, resplendent with tales of good against evil and characters who personify such, are projections of energies emanating from deep down in every man, woman, and child. Jung taught that the evil we see in the world is rooted within us as well. Thus, the devil is as much a part of our individual makeup as the God image, and there is no escaping this uncomfortable fact. So this is pretty important, right? Because in the beginning half of the book, we kind of made a huge case of that we're looking for this power, this energy, this God image, the universal mind, whatever it is, the great reality. It's that it's within, right? And then also what kind of comes along, it comes with the territory is the fact that the opposite of that higher power is also within. It's still a higher power, but it's that dark aspect, right? And so. And this is important, right? In chapter 7, we spoke about how there's this strange psychological feedback loop whereby if we project the God image out into the cosmos, then somehow that prohibits us from really taking ownership of our own problems. And Jung's the one who pointed this out. Wilson had discovered the antidote, right? When he adopted a psychological perspective of the God image and started looking inside, what he found when he looked inside was that he was the cause of his own problems. And so the antidote then to that negative kind of feedback loop or whatever is that we look inside of ourselves for answers. the same place where the problems exist. So we're kind of doing the same thing now with this dark energy. So we've made this big case throughout the book that, a man does not, or a person does not attain enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So when we're speaking of the devil, then it is the personification of that darkness, right? And so it's important to look at. And this brings us to the idea that we touched on last week, right? Which was both can be both. So this really underlies kind of everything we're going to talk about from here on out. Jung invited us to go deeper than really, then so and it's that we want to try to adopt a perspective where we almost see God and the devil on the same footing. So and this ties into our discussion from last week, right? Where I quoted the statement, both can be both. And um and what we have here is we're trying to understand how light and dark are sort of equal. Is we us in here, we have the image of the alcoholic to help us, which typically they don't have stuff like that out there, right? So we sort of get this insider view to this really kind of esoteric stuff that Jung was talking about. What this means is, one way I like to sort of illustrate this is to say that if we remove the variable of time, right, which is sort of the ego's realm, but if we remove the variable of time, in terms of alcoholism and drug addiction, sobriety and drunkenness would exist sort of side by side. They run parallel, right? That's what it means that both can be both. Each of these things forms an integral aspect of the whole person. So Jung explained that the ego is actually here and now, right? And so the ego is bound by space and time. But those kinds of variables don't exist in the objective psyche. They don't exist in the realm of the soul. Space and time are not, they're kind of temporary things that happen. So the archetypal energies that we're dealing with, they're also not subject to space and time the way the ego is, right? Which means that these energies, they run, they're not sequential or consecutive like we imagine. Rather, they run consecutively, simultaneously, not consecutively. They run simultaneously and concurrently. So this is how Jung says it. Today there exist supreme possibilities for both good and for evil. Usually, however, it is first one and then the other. The good man succumbs to evil, the sinner is converted to good, and that, to an uncritical eye, is the end of the matter. But those endowed with a finer moral sense or deeper insight cannot deny that this seeming one after another is in reality a happening of events side by side. And perhaps no one has realized this more clearly than St. Paul, who knew that he bore a thorn in the flesh and that the messenger of Satan smote him in the face, lest he be exalted above measure. The one after another is a bearable prelude to the deeper knowledge of the side by side. For this is an incomparably more difficult problem. Again, the view that good and evil are spiritual forces outside us, and that man is caught in the conflict between them, is more bearable by far than the insight that the oppositions are the ineradicable and indispensable preconditions of all psychic life, so much so that life itself is guilt. So here Jung really lays it out, right? That might be one of my favorite citations from Jung, that and that essentially we have the ego wants to sort of lay this process out in this sort of logical manner, right? And we tend to do that in terms of our own growth and our own sobriety or whatever it is we're struggling with. But that there's a more subtle, kind of deeper way to look at this, which is that these two things, they're functioning as an energy field, right? And that it is the ego that wants to place them and plot them like on a calendar or whatever, as one after another. But really, it's all taking place side by side. And So what we're looking at then, just kind of as a baseline too, I want to point out that the battle between good and evil, Christ and the Antichrist, right? This really is the basis of modern psychology, and it has its roots early in this eon, right? Just as the Christian church was sort of being established, and then they established the Christian doctrine and all this stuff. So and what occurred then was this split in the psyche. It's a great psychological split between good and evil. That's kind of the basis of it, right? And so and in the church's view, salvation exists in a final split, right? The ultimate split between good and evil, when Satan is literally cast out forever, and all the saints would just rejoice in this, realm of light. So it kind of ends in this ultimate split. What we're actually doing here is when I say here, I mean within Jungian psychology, as well as the 12 steps, is sort of, it's a response to that, right? It's almost an unconscious response. And it's not that we're looking for a split. What we're actually looking for is a fusion of the opposites. And so it's backwards, right? They're almost doing reverse order of what we're trying to do here. Um, So, and I love what he says about guilt, right? That life itself is guilt. Uh, for me, I experience the guilt as anxiety typically. Um, but it's just that sort of underlying angst that kind of colors, everything in the world. And really that angst is sort of the source of that energy, right? That is, like, I think what Jung is saying is that's sort of evidence of the numinosum. That is that kind of that energy field, that the polaristic powers are sort of, they're mingling, right? And they produce that sort of angst that we all feel all the time. Um, so, and when we talk about good and evil, right, we're really getting down to sort of the fundamental conversation that's the root of every spiritual tradition. So, and and like I said, we're looking for a fusion of opposites, and that these opposites are archetypal, right? Like we have the God image on one hand and the devil on the other. They're these sort of cosmogonic opposites, right? And this concept was so important in Carl Jung's mind, right? By 1961, that he includes it in his letter to Wilson. Um, and so it's very interesting that Jung literally just talks so much about the devil in his letter. And we just need to get into it to really try to understand what Jung's saying, like, because it's easy to kind of misread what Jung puts in the letter. So this kind of introduces it. It says the power of evil in 12-step mythology. We've already seen that when Jung wrote Psychological Types in 1921, he had begun to explore the problem of opposites, including the dark energies of the unconscious. In his letter to Wilson, Jung introduced the devil into his discussion about alcoholism, paving the way for us to weave a psychological conception of that dark image into our own spiritual journey. But Jung recognized how challenging such a task can be, admitting to Wilson that the devil is a widely misconstrued symbol, even when it's not being used in conjunction with a miscomprehended mental illness like alcoholism. Nonetheless, having read Wilson's letter, Jung felt confident enough in Bill's understanding of the psycho-spiritual nature of alcoholism to depict it from such an angle, adopting what he called medieval language to do so, a clear nod to Meister Eckhart and the other mystics he so admired. And I would add to that the other alchemists. Jung explained that it was a tack he refused to take with his patient Roland. And this is what Jung says to Bill in the letter. I am risking it with you, Bill, because I conclude from your very decent and honest letter that you have acquired a point of view above the misleading platitudes one usually hears about alcoholism. So this really kind of lays the groundwork for us to view alcoholism from an archetypal perspective, even though Jung never talked about the archetype of the alcoholic. Ming would have me insist that I'm the first one to do so. So just shout out to Ming. So basically, I want to talk a little bit about what Jung is referring here to when he tells Wilson that he'd acquired he says, Bill, I read your letter and I can see that your understanding of alcoholism far surpasses what we usually hear about it, those misleading platitudes, which, it's all over my TikTok feed, how alcoholism is sort of a traumatic response, or it's just a bad behavior, moral problem, whatever it is. When it's not, there's a much deeper layer to what's taking place with alcoholism, which we're going to talk about, and we've already talked about quite a bit. But what I think what Jung was probably most sort of related to the most with in Bill's letter was the fact that Bill, in his letter, essentially tells Jung that alcohol had produced an impossible dilemma for him, and that this dilemma was so profound that it caused his ego to basically deflate. He says collapse at depth, and that is like that's Jungian language. I mean, it's almost verbatim. And I don't know whether Wilson borrowed that language from his own Jungian therapist from the 40s or what, but Wilson has this really kind of Jungian perspective about how these pathologies work to deflate the ego. And that it is through that ego deflation that then we turn towards a supraordinate psychological entity, right? So Jungians would say that the ego suffers from a delusion of sovereignty or an assumption of omniscience, right? And Wilson says that we essentially have a delusion of control. And so Jung sees that Wilson sort of puts alcoholism within this framework, and so he's willing to take this risk, and he tells us it's a risk, right? He says, I'm willing to risk this with you based on your letter. And it's obviously not a tack he would take with Roland, who's basically just a brand new, barely sober guy that's, I mean, just like today, like a therapist would not do well to bring up the devil in therapy, right? Like it's so easy to misread what's being said here. And I got to say, I think it's still being misread even today by many therapists. I've had therapists tell me that I shouldn't call myself an alcoholic, that I'm pigeonholing myself, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, they just, you can't really explain it to them. They just don't get it. So I just tell them to read my book. So last week we saw that Jung employed alchemical symbolism in his letter, right? And we looked at spiritus contra spiritum as sort of an alchemical formula. And I want to point this out because we're going to actually rub up against this in the next few sessions, is that alchemy is where alchemy falls in terms of the historical development of like this spiritual tradition that we've adopted, right? Which is the 12 steps are clearly a part of. So when Christianity began to emerge, what they really sort of like became fixated on these images of light, and they diminished the role of the devil. And what happened then was that Gnosticism emerged at the same time in response to that to Christianity. So Gnosticism emerges and sort of runs underground. And Gnosticism, so Christianity is focused on this split, right? That God and that good and evil, or God and the devil, are split, and they need to be split even further. Gnosticism then comes and starts talking about the fusion of opposites, right? And that's alchemy grows out of Gnosticism. So the church fathers actually tried to completely destroy Gnosticism. That was the Inquisitions and stuff like that. And they burned all the books. They just got rid of Gnosticism. They tried to stamp it out. But alchemy was able to come, and I don't know if it was because it was so dense or so weird or something, but the alchemists were able to kind of get away with it for a while. And it came a little bit after all of the really bad shit that the church was doing. But it's just important to understand that alchemy is also kind of in response to this Christian dominant. That's what and when I talk about the dominant, it's sort of like the overarching psychological framework with which, the world sees itself. And I want to say too, and I said this earlier on in the book, we're still trapped in this dominant, okay? Like this sort of split, this great psychological split is still apparent today. And the 12 steps, like Gnosticism and like alchemy and like Jungian psychology, they come in response to this, right? They are literally a direct response to the theological or ecclesiastical framework that we all use to see the world. This is what Jung says about alchemy. Alchemy is rather like an undercurrent to the Christianity that ruled on the surface. It is to the surface as the dream is to consciousness, and just as the dream compensates the conflicts of the conscious mind, so alchemy endeavors to fill in the gaps left open by the Christian tension of opposites. And we see the same thing in the 12 steps. James Hollis says that Jungian psychology occurs within a culture, a mythless culture, right? And the 12 steps do the same thing. And what we do here, even though it's hard to see from the outside, is we actually fill in those gaps that are left in the church. And I find that we can point those out pretty easily. It's all the kind of this sort of weird language we use, and I don't know, it's actually beautiful once you kind of grasp what's taking place in the 12 steps within this more large context. So going back to the Wilson letter, so Wilson says that he experienced ego collapse at depth based on this state of utter confusion that developed, which he calls an impossible dilemma. Jung says that this is great. Like, he understands this from this sort of deeper perspective. And what I'm going to say is that it's not just the 12 steps. This is my current understanding of alcoholism and addiction in terms of an archetypal perspective, right? Which is the deepest layer through which we can understand a complex or something like that. So, the reductive aspect is to say that alcoholism comes in response to trauma. Like, that's what Gabor Mate is saying, right? It's purely reductive, personalistic, reductive. And we know, yeah, sure, some people can probably get sober by addressing their trauma issues, but there's this thing that we call the real alcoholic, right? And the real alcoholic can't get sober by addressing their trauma. We've all tried, many of us have tried it. It doesn't actually work. We have to get down to a deeper level, and on this sort of archetypal strata, I would suggest that alcoholism is also a response to the conscious dominant, right? That this longing for wholeness, or this thirst for wholeness, is so profound that we go searching for it through a means of intoxication. And based on modern culture's view of ayahuasca and LSD and mushrooms and all that, it's safe to say that collectively speaking, we view intoxication as this highly spiritual pursuit. So alcoholics then are sort of overly identified with that pursuit in and of itself. So, and I wanted to read this because here Jung he's expanding on the nature of this impossible dilemma that Wilson writes about. This is what Jung says. Confrontation with the shadow creates a standstill that hampers moral decisions and makes convictions ineffective or even impossible. Everything becomes doubtful, which is why the alchemists called this stage nigredo, tenebrositas, chaos, melancholia. It is right that the magnum opus should begin at this point, for it is indeed a well-nigh unanswerable question how one is to confront reality in this torn and divided state. Here, I must remind the reader who is acquainted with neither alchemy nor with the psychology of the unconscious that nowadays one very seldom gets into such a situation. Nobody now has any sympathy with the perplexities of an investigator who busies himself with magical substances, and there are relatively few people who have experienced the effects of an analysis of the unconscious on themselves, and almost nobody hits on the idea of using the objective hints given by dreams as a theme for meditation. This goes back to active imagination. If the ancient art of meditation is practiced at all today, it is practiced only in religious or philosophical circles, where a theme is subjectively chosen by the meditant or prescribed by an instructor. As in the Ignatian exercia, or in certain theosophical exercises that developed under Indian influence. These methods are of value only for increasing concentration and consolidating consciousness, but have no significance as regards affecting a synthesis of the personality. On the contrary, their purpose is to shield consciousness from the unconscious and to suppress it. They are therefore of therapeutic value only in cases where the conscious is liable to be overwhelmed by the unconscious and there is danger of a psychotic interval. So I actually stumbled on this. I wanted to read it just because it goes back to what we talked about in chapter 8. But this whole sort of, Jung's notion here is kind of dripping with 12-step ideology, right? That the ego comes up against this insoluble dilemma, and that there's no way it can think its way out of it. And that's really what describes, the last kind of weeks and months of my own, journey into addiction, right? It really is this stage of mass confusion, or what they call negretto. And so, that's so when we talk about shadow work, then, it's very interesting to point out that not only are we trying to find the shadow like within us, but also that the work begins in the shadows, right? That, and over the next few chapters, we're going to talk about the psychic component that pushes us, that drives us towards that impossible dilemma. It's called the self. Jung called it the self, just like Wilson did, actually. So with that basis, let's turn to Jung's letter to Bill, where he introduces the concept of archetypal evil into the conversation about alcoholism, right? This kind of risky paragraph that Jung gave to Bill says, this is Jung. He says, I am strongly convinced that the evil principle prevailing in this world leads the unrecognized spiritual need into perdition if it is not counteracted by a real religious insight or by the protective wall of human community. An ordinary man, not protected by an action from above and isolated by society, cannot resist the power of evil, which is very aptly called the devil. But the use of such words arouse so many mistakes that one can keep aloof from them as much as possible. And so, this statement really does need to be carefully unpacked. Like I said before, I think it's caused more confusion among some psychologists, at least, than it has actually helped. And it surprises me, but even some of the Jungians that I've talked to about the archetype of the alcoholic and about Jaime, they really have a hard time. They're like, oh, don't call him an alcoholic. That's not nice, And they just they just can't really wrap their head around it. And they don't understand the spiritual nature of it, right? And this all there, but there's kind of the flip side of this, which is really kind of shocking to me, and I love it. This is why I love you guys so much, is that we can talk about the devil and alcoholism and the role of evil in our lives and the violence of the God image, which we're going to get into, and the self, and just all these kind of really kind of dark and sort of profound spiritual concepts, and we're able to accept them, and just we can kind of work with them and make them real and see how they fit. Whereas if I give these kinds of seminars to like Jungian audiences, right, where there may or may not be any alcoholics in the midst, I really have to water it down, because they're just there's very few of them who can get on this level, right? This kind of archetypal level, and it's not for everyone. It's not that it's too dense. It's just that I think it requires a certain amount of personal experience. And as Jung said in that statement we read last slide, like, not everyone has the experience. They just don't know how to relate. And so this is how we begin to unpack Jung's statement in the last paragraph. So it says, this is perhaps the most challenging content of the Wilson letter, impossible to interpret properly outside of Jung's psychological approach. The religious tone of Jung's commentary on the plight of the alcoholic was one Wilson never adopted in his own writings, for the same reasons that a psychiatrist would hesitate to employ it with one of his patients. Jung's statement can easily be mistaken to imply that alcoholism stems from a moral deficiency. And yet, and that's the thing, right? When people tell me like, oh, you probably shouldn't call Jaime an alcoholic, that's not very nice. It's like, well, it wasn't a moral deficiency. Jaime didn't, there was nothing he could do about being an alcoholic. It was literally the unconscious self that drove him to it. So he was in the grips of an archetypal component. And that's, we're going to see, that's actually kind of that's sort of a, that's a badge of honor, right? In terms of Jungian thought, which we'll see in a couple slides. And yet Jung's letter is meant to challenge that old trope, still held by normies and drunkards alike, who believe that an alcoholic at base lacks either moral fortitude or properly focused self-discipline, or both. Jung salutes the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous for acquiring a point of view above these misleading platitudes, for it allowed him to frankly discuss the disease from a psychological perspective of Western myth. And that's what Jung's doing here, right? Is he's just really kind of overtly talking about alcoholism from this deeply spiritual / archetypal perspective, where he's pulling in the greatest symbols in Western thought, God and the devil, and using them as sort of the you know the basis for the conversation. So we've talked about these different types of dream analysis or psychological approaches, analytical analysis. And there's three of them. I just wanted to touch on them, right? Because we have the literal, the reductive, and the archetypal. The literal and reductive are almost the same. But the literal approach in terms of dreams as well as myth is to just really see the stories or the characters in the dreams as reflections of real events in real life, right? In other words, like if I have a dream about my wife, then a literal approach to interpreting that dream would be that it was actually about her, which explains why if there's kind of that running joke, right? It's like, oh, I'm in trouble today. Why? Oh, my wife dreamed that I cheated on her last night, right? And it's like, well, it's just a dream. But the literal approach can't really see it as just a dream. So it gets tied up in that sort of those feelings about it. And then we do the same thing in terms of our myths, right? We think that they're literal stories or historical stories. And in doing so, we completely miss the whole boat. And this is in sort of waking consciousness. This would be comparable to a person who thinks that every thought they have is a reflection of the truth. In other words, that they believe everything they think. And so we really need to get past that perspective because it's dangerous. The second approach is the reductive approach. This one approaches dreams from a more personalistic standpoint. But really it's really tricky, because if we use the reductive approach, then our dreams tend to give us this sort of, it's like when you interpret your dreams from the archetypal approach. So like, for example, if I have a dream about 4 skulls, right? The reductive approach would want to kind of tell me that is perhaps bad news, that somehow my relationship to the feminine is dying and it's weak or it's dead or something like that, right? That's the reductive approach. But if I look at this from an archetypal approach, then I recognize that these symbols that are appearing in my dreams are the same symbols that appear in myth, and that they're speaking to a different sort of a deeper layer. And so really an image of 4 skulls, rather than saying that something is bad, it's actually could be saying something quite different, that the relationship to these things has undergone a fundamental change, and that it's actually good. So the reason I brought this up is because I want to keep it in mind in terms of this letter that Jung wrote to Wilson, right? That we can look at his statements about the devil and a person's lack of spiritual connection from a reductive perspective, or we can go deeper, which Jung certainly would have wanted us to go deeper, that there's a more archetypal level to look at this stuff from. And this means that, so in terms of looking at evil and the devil from an archetypal perspective, the question then is not what we do to sort of eradicate evil in our lives, right? It's the same thing we do with step 6 and 7. We don't like list our character defects and then start working on them to make them go away. If they're actually character defects, we can't do that, right? They're kicking our ass. They are autonomous psychic complexes, right? That the ego is literally powerless over. Those are the real problems. Those are the impossible dilemmas that are meant to bring the ego to this place of despair where it doesn't know what to do, right? And when we get to those sort of situations, right, where the ego's out of options, we turn to the archetypal approach for answers, which would tell us that rather than try to sort of eliminate evil from our lives, the approach we want to take is to actually assimilate the evil, right? And this is an esoteric process that's really only symbolized because if you ask me how you do that, I would say, I don't know. Like you need to take that like to your dreams and stuff like that. But if you recall, 3 sessions ago, we saw that in alchemy, there was a king and the king drank too much. He got sick. The doctors came, they put him in the sweat lodge. They tried to dry him out, and he ended up dying. And then the next set of doctors came and they dried the king out even more, and they actually killed him. Like he was really dead this time. He only looked dead before, but then they chopped him up into small pieces, ground him into powder, mixed some salt and some water into it, put him back in the oven, and then boom, voila, the king came and he was sort of reborn, right? That's the story of how we synthesize these dark powers, right? How we assimilate them. And our dreams are going to give us information about where we're at in that process. So, yes. So I like what Edinger says. The synthetic archetypal approach opens the door to the unconscious and is by no means appropriate for everyone. The personalistic or reductive modes of explanation are the appropriate ones for an immature ego. And so again, in terms of the Wilson letter, there's certainly a way of reading what Jung says to Wilson in terms of the devil as saying, yes, alcoholics in general have sort of a problem with their moral compass, right? And I think that's probably true. But to solve alcoholism doesn't require that we get it, that we just straighten up morally, right? Like often it's like the more immoral, the more dark, the more dangerous our lives become, the better chance we have at actually getting clean and sober. And so there's a paradox at play here, right? And these paradoxical images are what will sort of reveal what's taking place in the unconscious. In our discussion of alcoholism from this archetypal perspective, it's far more than just a personal maladjustment or an unconscious response to trauma. Jung's statement is a powerful message regarding the archetypal energies at play in the divine drama of alcoholism, which itself is an unconscious response to the cultural dominant. So alcoholism is to me, it would appear in my own world, in my own life, my own experience, what I understand is that my using and drinking was an attempt to fuse the opposites in the midst of a culture that would have me deny my dark half. And this helps me understand why I'm so drawn to the darkness, right? That and why it felt so good to go into an AA meeting and hear somebody talk about God and then say the F word in the same sentence. And I was like, wow, like I was like, holy cow, I can access spiritual power, but I don't have to be this sort of religious fanatic, right? And that felt really good to me. So, because what's at play here is a thirst for wholeness, right? Which is why too, when I drift too far into the realm of the light, there's something in me that will always want to pull me back into the darkness, right? And the goal for me is to really try to live in the murkiness, right? In the midst of both. And yeah, and the battle that we've been called to participate in really is one which has its roots in the very fabric of Western culture, right? Where these two opposing worldviews that have been sort of recapitulated in so many different ways, spirit versus matter, good versus evil, light versus dark, that's the battle we're engaging in terms of alcoholism and addiction. This is what I write. And while he knew his discussion of the devil would trigger the religious prejudice of many who read the letter, Jung believed that the function that symbol plays is so paramount in the process of individuation that we avoid it at our own peril. The very fact that our Western spiritual vocabulary lacks adequate substitutes for the symbol of the devil is why Jung insisted on using it in his illustration to Wilson, fraught as it is. Relating the alcoholics' battles with their own personal demons to the overarching story told in our Western myths of the cosmogonic conflict between God and the devil can be tricky even for 12-steppers who have adopted a relative view of the God image and are laboring intensely in an attempt to integrate the shadow. And yet the most profound life-changing truth becomes available only after we confront our longest-held prejudices, religious and otherwise. And so, I think that what I want to point out here is just that last sentence, right? That the most profound life-changing truth becomes available only after we confront our longest held prejudices, religious and otherwise. You know, because for me, um, that has been the case. And the journey really started with me looking at, my relationship to these symbols, right? Like the God image, the devil, uh, just sort of the religious prejudices that we kind of address here in the rooms. And then as I began working the steps, I had to look at other prejudices, right? Um, and to where I've now, where I'm at today is like I'm really trying to look at the way, just what are my prejudices with the people around me? What are my prejudices against women? What are my prejudices against men? Like just kind of the whole thing, like because what I discover is when I can get underneath that stuff, I get new insight. I can find new ways of having compassion and everything else. So I really wanted to make that statement, and I think I make it actually twice in the book. So, all right. So when we talk about, the good versus evil, um, and the devil, right? And uh how how these things are kind of manifesting in our lives, right? Like these symbols. I wanted to bring up this citation. This is from chapter 5. This is a Jung citation, and I'm hoping now that it makes more sense than it did when we first encountered it. Um, and I thought about this last week too, and because I just really wanted to bring it up because for me, it's actually starting to make a lot more sense. So this is what it says. Every great experience in life, every profound conflict evokes the accumulated treasure of these mythical images and brings about their inner constellation. But they become accessible to consciousness only when the individual possesses so much self-awareness and power of understanding that he also reflects on what he experiences instead of just living it blindly. In the latter event, they actually live the myth and the symbol without knowing it. So what Jung says here is that those people who don't reflect on what they experience and rather just live it blindly, they just sort of go through life having things kind of happen to them, and they're unable to really do introspection and figure out what's causing these things to happen. They're still living the myth, but they're actually living the myth blindly, right? What this means is that, so in the olden days, right, in ancient times, the energies that emanated from the unconscious were called gods and devils, and these sort of unconscious components were projected into the world, which they still are to a large extent. What we're doing now in the 12 steps in Jungian psychology is we're trying to look at the gods. We're trying to see the gods as psychic factors, right? And when we do that, then we sort of place ourselves within the myth, right? So we're not just living the myth blindly, right? But what we do is we actually enter into the myth, and we're now participating in the divine drama. We play the central role in the myth once we see that. Um, this I love this conversation because this helps us to understand really kind of the fundamentals of what Jung was trying to teach, right? And it really is all based on this concept of the autonomous psychic complexes, or the objective psyche, the great unconscious, that we have experienced so deeply in our own lives just by the extent that we've done, step 1, right? We've admitted that we were powerless over something, whatever it was, and that our lives were unmanageable. That's really that's a capitulation to the fact that there is some deeper, kind of more supraordinate entity within my own brain that my ego can't control, can't understand, and is really subject to. This is a footnote in this chapter, and I love this, especially in terms of this Wilson letter. It says, in the Middle Ages, they spoke of the devil, but today we call it a neurosis. And that really is the essence of Jungian psychology, right? It's that these archetypal energies, they manifest in our lives, and we can call them by whatever we will, but really they're sort of emanating out of the objective psyche. And so within the context of alcoholism, the neurosis, stems in response to the cultural dominant, right? And what I've shown in chapter 13 or chapter 11 was that it really is the trickster component of the psyche that is kind of running the show in terms of of alcoholism, right? Which leads us to postulate the archetype of the alcoholic. Now, going back to this, to the insoluble dilemma, right? And the trickster is the one who produces that insoluble dilemma, right? It tricks us into thinking we have into thinking we have control, whatever, and it basically drives us towards the breaking point, which is where we have to essentially dissolve the delusion of control. We recognize that we don't actually have control, and the impossible dilemma is really the only thing that will collapse that delusion of control, right? The ego isn't going to think its way into relationship with the objective psyche. It has to be convinced, right? Through this what Wilson calls it a tedious process, right? And this is the point, that oftentimes that when the self is driving us towards this impossible dilemma, it actually will very often turn into an acute neurosis, such as alcoholism, depression, addiction, whatever it is, right? And so then neurosis then becomes sort of another effective tool that the objective psyche uses. So just like the objective psyche will sort of make symbolical images sprout, right? It does the same thing with neuroses and complexes, right? Both are tools that the self uses in order to attract attention to itself. Recall from the earlier quote that sometimes the self makes playful attempts to have us pay attention, right? Well, other times the attempts aren't so playful. They feel playful in the beginning, but eventually they become dark and dangerous. So I'm going to read, this is a paragraph in the book. Similar to the conflict between instinct and spirit, the psychological push and pull between good and evil represent an insoluble dilemma, meaning that at a certain point it can only be answered by the antithetical energies emanating from the unconscious. Jung explains that the unconscious will first respond to such a quandary with a compensatory image in a dream or myth with which to help the psyche move toward an integration of the opposites. However, in certain cases where the attention becomes more heightened, the unconscious may take the lead rather than just respond, he says, whipping up a neurosis that aids in waking one up from their state of spiritual antipathy. Thanks to the neurosis contrived by the unconscious, they are shaken out of their apathy, and this in spite of their own laziness and often desperate resistance, end quote. And while psychopathology can actually help to open the door to a middle way, Jung says that, unfortunately, most people are unwilling to push up against the limits of their mental and moral fortitude. Despite their notorious unconsciousness, most people never get anywhere near a neurosis. Now, reading on, it says, ironically, Jung refers to those for whom such a troubled state does develop as higher types. People whose nature does not in the long run persist in what is for them an unnatural torpor. Bit by bit, energy accumulates in the unconscious and finally explodes in the form of a more or less acute neurosis. In the case of alcoholics and drug addicts, 12-step experience tells us that they are people who, as a rule, find it unbearable to exist without a functioning and reliable set of mythological symbols with which to contain the emergent energies of the unconscious. Wilson describes them as people who are handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice towards spiritual ideas, who feel every conflict intensely, reminiscent of the insoluble tension of opposites they can sense brewing within as much as without their souls. And in a desperate search for a resolution, they turn their spiritual gaze toward drinking and drugging, finding it in a way to at least temporarily escape. For alcoholics, their dedication to spirits eventuates an acute neurosis, the solution to which demands the recognition and unavoidable integration of the shadow. Thus, alcoholism creates the perfect setup for a person to stumble upon the path to wholeness, as the need to keep the primordial energies of the unconscious bottled up becomes paramount not just for one's continued sense of well-being, but for one's very survival. Basically, what I'm saying here is that there's this tension of opposites that's kind of brewing in the culture, and that or just in life in general, right? Life itself is guilt, but that the culture doesn't have a response to it, right? The culture's response is not a satisfactory response because it tells you to just lean into the light and everything will be fine. But those of us who are sort of working on this deeper level, right, this sort of more archetypal connection, we're just not satisfied with that answer. We suffer from a very profound thirst for wholeness, right? And so we go searching for wholeness out here, and very often that sort of develops into a neurosis, but that's not a problem. Jung says that people who are neurotic are of a higher type. I remember when I was writing this, my my editor is not an alcoholic, and she just didn't get it. Like, I had to essentially write this part without her because it was impossible to get her on board with the fact that having a neurosis makes you a higher type. Um, but it's true though, but it's higher, but it's more dangerous, like, and it really goes back to the trickster, right? The trickster literally stumbles his way into spiritual awakening, right? And becomes a shaman, like, just through stupidity is able to accomplish what others fail to do with their best efforts. And that is such a good description of what takes place in the 12 steps. Um, I mean, I have the opportunity to talk to some pretty smart people, some Jungians. I mean, and like we just understand this like really deep stuff, but we didn't do anything to learn it. They've gone to 12 years of college and university and everything else, and they're struggling to have this experience, right? Whereas we're just like, well, you just you got to go into the darkness, man. So if good and evil represent a juxtaposition of opposites, a split between two psychological states of being, then their fusion, and this is kind of a Jungian idea, their fusion represents the introduction of a third thing. And that third thing is represented as the filius mercurius in alchemy, the thing that we've talked about last week, the child of the sun and moon, right? The reborn alcoholic. The trickster morphed into a shaman, right? The trickster was an individual who struggled, to find his way between two opposing states of being. And when the trickster learns to fuse those animalistic aspects with the more spiritual side, then what happens is there's a transformation into the third thing, right? And that's the shaman. So Jung likens this function to a waterfall, which I just love. He says, if a person's recognition of the shadow is as complete as he can make it, then conflict and disorientation ensue, an equally strong yes and no, which he can no longer keep apart by a rational decision. So he's talking about what a process that people would go through when they sit down on the couch with him, right? And they really dig into the work, and I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years into this process, this sort of happens, right? This disorientation, the shadows becoming, this person doing a lot of work, right? And they come up against an insoluble dilemma. He says this person cannot transform his clinical neurosis into the less conspicuous neurosis of cynicism. In other words, he can no longer hide the conflict behind a mask. It requires a real solution and necessitates a third thing in which the opposites can unite. And this is what happens to us in the 12 steps. Here, the logic of the intellect usually fails, for in a logical antithesis, there is no third. In other words, what we're trying to do here is figure out how 1 + 1 = 3, right? But logically that doesn't work. But actually though, if I say that in a 12-step room, most people in the room understand exactly what I mean. 1 + 1 = 3. Ebby plus Bill sitting at the kitchen table represents a third higher power. The solvent can only be of an irrational nature. In nature, the resolution of opposites is always an energetic process. She acts symbolically in the truest sense of the word, doing something that expresses both sides, just as a waterfall visibly mediates between above and below. The waterfall itself is then the incommensurable third. In an open and unresolved conflict, dreams and fantasies occur which, like the waterfall, illustrate the tension and nature of the opposites and thus prepare the synthesis. And so, you know, going back to really active imagination and what sort of concrete actions we can take out of these seminars, right? It's that in sobriety, deep into sobriety, however deep we are into this thing, right? If we've gone through the steps and stuff, I guarantee we're still struggling with some sort of tension of opposites, right? And that it could be a useful practice to begin meditating and using our dreams and the images of our dreams and our active imaginations to try to see what, maybe just to see what the unconscious is trying to tell us directly, right? It's pretty interesting. I mean, the objective psyche gave Bill Wilson 12 steps, right? And then the question is, what is it trying to give us? You know, what sort of feast on a platter is the objective psyche trying to give to me that I'm unwilling to accept or work for because my ego tells me, oh, that shit won't work, right? But that's the thing. It's irrational. The ego's always going to say that it won't work. Every single morning when I think, oh, I should write that dream down, my ego says, nah, it's not that important. That's not an important dream. And so I literally miss half my dreams because my ego tells me that they don't mean anything, right? That it's a beautiful symbol of how this process works. And this is kind of in conclusion regarding the talk about neurosis and recovery. A strong case could be made based on how widespread the disease is, coupled with how common 12-step recovery has become, that alcoholism is among the most potent of modern means capable of igniting a quest for enlightenment, as it taps directly into the dark, archaic urges of the unconscious. It really taps into that trickster element, right? The root of profound spiritual energy. Jung says that it's impossible to determine whether the unconscious is striving to realize certain definite ends, though he admits that when it comes to certain psychopathologies, there is evidence to support the claim that, in fact, they do evince an urge towards self-realization. So what he's saying here is that we can't know what the unconscious is really up to. It's unconscious. So like as a rule, it's unconscious, therefore we don't know. We can only postulate. What he's saying here is that there's evidence to suggest that neuroses, certain types of neuroses, which I would definitely say that alcoholism and addiction and whatever brings you into this room, you know, that those do evince an urge towards self-realization. In other words, the very fact of having the neurosis is evidence that the self is calling you to something higher, to a deeper and more profound understanding of both yourself and the world around you. That you've been called to help humanity sort of move forth and move forward in the world. Alcoholism in particular fulfills just such an urge, and we might even go so far as to guess that this unique form of mental and spiritual illness has been derived by the universal mind in response to the West's mythlessness as a means to bring about an expansion of spiritual consciousness for the collective, who is in dire need of a new myth. And while such a postulate might seem a stretch, it's worthy of note that as a means of human transformation, alcoholism and addiction represent a double-edged sword, razor sharp on both sides. The neurosis punctures the ego, bringing about the prerequisite psycho-spiritual death. And the accompanying archetypal image of wholeness, the alcoholic, aids the ego in integrating the supraordinate polaristic powers it has encountered in the psyche. And so I think I'm going to end there. So I do have more slides just that talk about the last section of the book, which is just really a Joseph Campbell quote about approaching the temple. It's really easy stuff to read and just kind of understand. There's no new, dramatic information that I would present on that. And since we're 10 minutes over already, I think I'm going to go ahead and end it. Yeah, so I'll turn it back over to Duncan.
Wow. Thank you, Cody. Everybody, you can unmute. Let's thank Cody with whatever celebratory sounds and
Thank you.
gestures.
Thank you, Cody. Woo.
Thank you,
Cody.
Bravo, Cody.
Hey,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Profound work, Cody.
Woohoo!
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
So grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Wow. This is fun. Oh, hold on. Let me find this. We're going to go now to the Q&A portion. We'll have each person will have 90 seconds to ask a question, and Cody will do his best to answer. And remember, we'll be trying to get Cody out of here by 2 minutes before the top of the hour. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can put your question in the chat to me, and I will try to weave it in. And if you would like to ask your question personally, Patrick, come on in.
Chayla had her hand up before me.
Kayla, come on in.
Chayla, yeah.
Oh, I didn't quite expect that. My battery's been going a lot, so I missed some of it. But I had a question. How does fusing the opposites within us of the God and the devil help us to recover in simplistic terms?
So I really appreciate this question. I mean, and the hard part is to put it into simplistic terms, right? So and I can really speak from experience here. And so it kind of like the conversation, you know, it's like that same thing of like, you know, if you tell a newcomer like, hey, if you just, you know, I did the 12 steps, it changed my life. You know, the answer is a paradox, right? It's interesting that the images that the unconscious kicks up to really depict the fusion of the opposites are like these really paradoxical scenes, right? Like, for example, the sun and the moon mating and creating a baby, right? And then this baby is a hermaphrodite, right? Like it's got male and female sex organs or whatever. So and that's the word hermaphrodite is what it's almost like to refer to like a plant, right? Like it's this mixture of it's you know, it's water, it's air, it's fire, it's earth. It's all four elements combined into one, right? So it's this really paradoxical process that the ego, we can't really explain it. Like we want to have it in really concrete terms because that's the way we're programmed to approach everything in today's world. And what we're being called to do here is to really set aside that secular kind of understanding and to take a plunge into the dark, which the psyche is dark. It's the unconscious is a dark place. We don't know what actually is going on there. It's unconscious. So in simplistic terms, I think Wilson gives it to us the most simply that it can possibly be given, which was to say that for us, the problem has been removed. We didn't even do anything about it. It just happened. And we were placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. And so if we consider any of our impossible dilemmas from that simplified perspective, then it tells us how it explains that it did happen, right? It was a paradox. We don't know exactly how it happened, but that it did happen, and that the results are that we have found ourselves in the middle, safe and protected. So that's how I would do my best to answer that wonderful question. Thank you. Thank you, Kayla.
Thanks, Cody. Patrick.
Okay, Cody, thank you. Great. One question of clarification. On one slide, you said, thus, alcoholism creates the perfect setup for a person to stumble upon the path to wholeness, as the need to keep the primordial energies of the unconscious bottled up becomes paramount, not just for one's continued sense of well-being, but for one's very survival. Okay. Now, when you say the need to keep the primordial energies of the unconscious bottled up, do you mean the need to keep them separately bottled up? The good in the good bottle and the bad in the bad bottle? Or do you mean, what do you mean?
I love that. So I remember the sentiment that I used to write that was really in sort of in terms of the cultural spiritual crisis, right? That and that that like my friend, one of my friends, Hero, we were talking once, and he said that, you know, the spiritual malady exists in the entire culture, but that we have the advantage or the disadvantage, depending on which end of it you're sitting on, right? But that the advantage that we have is that if we don't do something about it, it's going to kill us, right? And so and I love what you said about having the two bottles. No, these primordial energies, they need to go into the same bottle, right? Just as when we were drinking, we drank out of a singular bottle, right? That on one hand, when I drank, I was having a profound spiritual connection, but on the other hand, it was this very dark and sort of deadly, chemical that could kill me. So I think the paradox of drinking itself, right? That spiritus contra spiritum paradox, it's the same thing in recovery, and that the goal is that we have to learn to deal with these energies in an effective way, because they stare us in the face and will kill us if we don't. So
you could say the need to harness these primordial energies in a life-affirming manner. Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That, right. And perhaps bottled up isn't it's probably not the right word, right? Like, in terms of like, we need to contain them, but we also don't want to put the lid on it, like we have to. Does that make sense? Is that so? Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. That's like, because now I think I see where the confusion could come in with that statement. So
okay, so you could win the poetry prize for the alcoholic for using the term bottled up, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. My second point, and I just want to throw it in there for further discussion later maybe, is the whole concept of collective denial. Because every time you talk about going out to the Jungians and trying to get the message across, there's a certain frustration, right, which I can understand in the response. I think the reason for that response lies in the collective denial. And we all know about denial on the individual level because we've all been through there. But that denial exists in the collective unconscious also. And I think that part of this discussion at some point should address the whole issue of collective denial. And I think Ann Wilson Schaaf is a lady who did wonderful work on that topic in the last 2 decades of her life. I don't know if you know her work, but I just throw that in there as a inspiration, perhaps.
Cool.
Thank you, Patrick. Sharon.
Thank you, Duncan. Cody, thank you again. I don't know where I'm going to go, but I'm going to go with this. You started at the very top of the session talking about a 4th step. And I'm in the midst of redoing a 4th step. And my father was the alcoholic. And I think if I'm going, I may refer to what Patrick and Cologne just said, collective denial. Because in the family, there was collective denial about the good and the evil that we experienced when my father was in his alcoholic state versus when he was in his non-alcoholic state. And I want to thank you, because what you brought to me this morning is the fusion of that man's personality and what he was so desperately seeking in his life. And I can now understand that more profoundly. So a little bit with Patrick's question would be, how do you best come to terms with that, as I am the daughter of an alcoholic who has had, and I'm in the process of healing, a very active addiction. Both of us were seeking spiritus. He in alcohol fermented, and me in sugar unfermented. So do you address the familial as well?
So I don't address the familial in the book, and I'm currently I'm probably in a little too much darkness myself to really address the familial, because I too come from an alcoholic home, and with therapy that I've been doing recently, like you know, a lot of the sort of pain has kind of resurfaced. You know, early on in sobriety, I was kind of able to really dodge a lot of pain by just taking blame for the whole thing
Yep.
and making amends. And then it was like, okay,
Yep.
we're good now. I can just get along. But as I was doing therapy, you know, I slipped up and told my therapist one day that my mom had called and I didn't really feel like taking the phone call. And like a vulture, she just like latched onto that. And we ended up spending the next 5 or 6 weeks talking about that and my own sort of relationship to them and the guilt that I'm feeling versus like the pain that they've caused. In my case, I was the scapegoat, right? So, which I have a whole slew of investigating to do into that archetype, because it is an archetype. Murray Stein speaks of the scapegoat as an archetype, and you know, so yeah, so I'm sort of in the middle of kind of wading through some of that pain now. So you know, I have contact with my parents and stuff, but I have to say that since I've taken therapy more seriously, like my relationship with them has changed dramatically. Sadly, you know, my relationship with many people has changed. Um, Only very scant few of those people has the relationship I felt like become stronger, right? But all the other relationships have become far more honest, which it can feel a little bit isolating, I think, but also like but it's a better position to be in for me mentally, emotionally. So yeah. And I
You're
am
talking,
happy to go ahead.
Cody, you're talking about what I'm working through with ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and it is isolating. But the gift, and I said this at a meeting last Thursday, the gift is I have found containers in the 12-step world that let me be authentic, let me speak my truth, and they reflect back to me appropriate or inappropriate, dark or light shadow in that process, which I'm going through right now with a very clear incident in my life. So thank you for saying that even the types of children reared in alcoholic or dysfunctional families, the scapegoat, I can't remember all of them, but scapegoats are archetypes because that'll give me a tool to look into as well. I'm finished. I'll let you address someone else's question. Thank you again, Cody. I'm getting so much out of this.
Thank you, Sharon. I love having you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Cody. Yeah, let's explore how ACA recovery addresses the familial after we close the meeting today in the fellowship time. And after I'm able to attract Cody into ACA recovery, he may have another book in him that explains more. Chris Ketz, please come in.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Cody, and everyone. I'm very interested in this quote at the end of Jung around the neurotic is of the highest, not exact wording again, but just interested in neuroses, if that is linked to anxiety as well, and how does that become a key or something that leads to some kind of greater understanding? Is there an archetype that is attached to that?
Sure. Yeah, great question. You know, I think that so to answer the question about anxiety, I mean, I'm so familiar with anxiety. It's like my second, you know, it's like my, I don't know, it's just always sort of with me. And I think that anxiety is I think it's probably a healthy response to some of the things that I have to face in life, you know. I think that the culture wants to produce a certain sense of anxiety in order to get us to be productive. And so there is kind of a battle with it, and I constantly am sort of facing anxiety each day. Whether or not anxiety counts as a neurosis, you know, I I don't know. I think that, you know, anxiety can be a very kind of motivating factor. Like if I have a certain problem and I'm super anxious. So for example, recently I've been experiencing some financial insecurity, and and this answers your question as to how it becomes sort of an impetus for growth. the anxiety became so unbearable that I finally capitulated and was like, all right, I'm going to do this active imagination stuff. And so I did, and I dreamed up an image, and I wrote about it. And a couple days later, because of course my ego was like, oh, that's stupid. That's a dumb image. That won't work. But then later when I revisited it, because the anxiety just would not let up, I ran it through this sort of process of active imagination. I just, to recall, I sort of just let it be sacrificed on an altar, and it just burned up. And as I let my psyche go through that process, it actually helped the anxiety to really diminish in this respect. So the archetype is really this archetype of change in general, right? We talked about the Negretto, which is this sort of darkness, right? This chaotic situation out of which the new element emerges. And that, in the case of anxiety, that's just that's the starting point of this magnum opus. And that's the case with every sort of psychological and insoluble dilemma that we have, whether it's, depression, alcoholism, anxiety, whatever it is. It becomes the impetus that sort of gets us moving. And by tapping into it, we tap into the profound powers that are available to allow us to change. So, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cody. Cody, it's 12:56. I want to set you free. Why don't you close us out? And you can make your other appointment, and we will continue on with our fellowship time after we close the meeting. I'll just pass. We'll be back here next Tuesday.